Story number 1. The Stranger in the Ceiling. Moving to Tokyo had always been a dream of mine. As a graduate student in linguistics, I was thrilled to receive a scholarship that allowed me to live and study in one of the world's most vibrant cities. Finding an apartment, however, was another story. Tokyo is notoriously expensive, and my student stipend didn't leave much room for luxury. That's how I ended up in a tiny, one-room unit in a slightly run-down building on the outskirts of Shinjuku. The apartment was modest, to say the least. The ceilings were low, the walls thin, and the kitchen barely large enough to prepare a cup of instant ramen. But it was cheap, and it was mine, or at least, I thought it was. The first sign that something was off came about a month after I moved in. I'd just gotten back from a long day of classes and reached for the carton of milk I'd bought that morning. When I opened the fridge, it was half empty. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd used it earlier, but I was sure I hadn't. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Grad school had me exhausted, and I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it started happening more often. Food would go missing: a few slices of bread, a banana, even a container of leftovers I'd been looking forward to eating. First, I assumed I was just being careless, maybe leaving things out or eating them without realizing. But then I began noticing other things. The odd creak of the floorboards at night, objects slightly out of place, a faint, musky smell that didn't belong to me. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, a soft shuffling noise, faint but distinct, coming from above. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old building. It was deliberate, like footsteps. My heart began to race as the sound grew louder, moving from one end of the ceiling to the other. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, a stray cat or a large rat scurrying around in the crawl space. But the idea didn't sit well with me. Whatever it was, it sounded heavier than any animal I'd ever heard. The noises continued over the next few nights. By this point, I was sleeping with the lights on, my nerves frayed from the constant unease. I mentioned it to my landlord, but he waved it off, muttering something about old pipes and structural settling. I wasn't convinced. One evening, as I sat at my tiny kitchen table, I heard a soft thud from above, followed by a faint scraping sound. My gaze darted to the ceiling vent in the corner of the room. It was small, just large enough to allow air circulation, but something about it unsettled me. The slats were slightly ajar, as if they'd been tampered with. I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and peered into the vent with my phone flashlight. For a moment, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, just as I was about to pull back, I caught a glimpse of something, a flash of movement, quick and shadowy. My stomach lurched, and I nearly fell off the chair. That night, couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the vent, half expecting something or someone to crawl out of it. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I borrowed a ladder from a neighbor and climbed up to the small crawl space above my apartment. The landlord had mentioned it once when I moved in, describing it as an inaccessible area for old wiring and insulation. The hatch was stiff, but I managed to pry it open. A cold, stale draft greeted me as I hoisted myself into the dark space. It was cramped, dusty, and littered with cobwebs. I shone my flashlight around, expecting to find nothing, but as the beam swept across the space, it landed on something that made my blood run cold. Pile of blankets, plastic bag filled with trash, and an assortment of items that unmistakably belonged to me. My missing socks, a half-empty bag of chips, and a bottle of water I hadn't seen in weeks. Someone had been living here. I scrambled back down, my hands shaking. My first thought was to call the police, but a part of me hesitated. What if they didn't believe me? What if whoever was up there heard me and fled before they arrived? I decided to set up a trap instead. That evening, I left the apartment as usual, making a point to lock the door and jangle the keys loudly. But instead of heading to campus, I doubled back and hid in the stairwell, peering through the small window into my unit. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as I was beginning to doubt myself, I saw it. The vent cover slid open, and a hand emerged, followed by a face. It was a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hair matted and his clothes tattered. He moved cautiously, glancing around before climbing down into my apartment. I watched in horror as he rifled through my kitchen cabinets, eating a piece of bread and drinking straight from my milk carton. I called the police immediately, my voice barely above a whisper as I described what was happening. They arrived within minutes, bursting into the apartment and apprehending the man without incident. He didn't resist, his expression blank and resigned. The officers told me he was likely a squatter, someone who had slipped into the building unnoticed and found a way into my apartment through the vent system. He'd probably been living there for months, surviving off my food and supplies. Though the man was taken away, I couldn't shake the feeling of violation. The idea that someone had been living above me, watching me, moving through my space when I wasn't there, was too much to bear. I packed my belongings and left the apartment the next day, breaking the lease without a second thought. Even now, in a new apartment across the city, I find myself glancing at the vents, checking the locks, and listening for sounds that don't belong. The man was flesh and blood, not some ghost or spirit, but the fear he left behind feels just as haunting. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't supernatural. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. Story number 2. The crying in the walls. When my wife, Emily, and I found the apartment in Los Angeles, felt like a dream come true. It was small but cozy, with enough room for us and our 3-year-old son, Henry, nestled in a quiet neighborhood with a charming courtyard. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh after years of struggling in a cramped studio. We signed the lease without hesitation, unaware of the darkness that lurked behind its walls. The first few weeks were blissful. We painted the living room a warm shade of cream, hung family photos, and filled the space with laughter and the scent of Emily's cooking. But soon, things began to change. It started with the sounds. Late at night, after we'd tucked Henry into bed and settled onto the couch to watch TV, we'd hear it soft, faint crying, like the muffled sobs of a child. At first, we thought it was coming from one of the neighboring apartments. It was an old building, after all, and the walls weren't exactly soundproof. But as the nights went on, the crying grew more distinct, always emanating from the same spot, the wall between the living room and the hallway. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked one evening, her eyes wide as she turned down the volume on the TV. I nodded, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Maybe it's just the neighbors," I suggested, though my voice lacked conviction. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too haunting. It wasn't just noise, it was a plea. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. While Emily and Henry were out, I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear. The crying was faint but unmistakable, accompanied by soft whispers I couldn't quite make out. I knocked on the wall, hoping to dispel the unsettling feeling creeping over me. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. When I told Emily about it, she looked uneasy. "Maybe we should talk to the landlord," she said. "There could be something wrong with the building." I agreed, and the next day, I called Mr. Hargrove, the building's manager. He arrived that afternoon, a stout man with thinning hair and a brusque manner. When I explained what we'd been hearing, he waved it off with a dismissive laugh. "Old buildings like this make all kinds of noises," he said. "Pipes, settling walls, creaky floorboards, nothing to worry about." "But it sounds like crying," Emily pressed, her arms crossed. Mr. Hargrove shrugged. "You're probably imagining it. Happens all the time in places like this." He left soon after, but his explanation did little to ease our minds. The crying continued, night after night, growing louder and more persistent. Henry started waking up in the middle of the night, crying and pointing to the living room. "She's sad," he'd say, his small voice trembling. "Who's sad?" "Sweetheart," Emily asked, holding him close. "The girl," Henry whispered. "She's in the wall." That was the breaking point. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I decided to investigate further. With Emily's reluctant approval, I borrowed a drill and began to carefully cut into the wall. Dust filled the air as I worked, revealing layers of plaster and old wood. Finally, after hours of effort, I uncovered something that stopped me cold. Behind the wall was a small, hidden room, no larger than a closet. The air inside was stale and cold, as if it had been sealed off for years. The room was filled with old, decaying toys, a ragged teddy bear, a doll with one missing eye, and a tiny rocking horse. In the corner lay a faded photograph of a young girl, her dark eyes staring out from beneath a curtain of glossy black hair. Emily stood behind me, her hand over her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is this?" I picked up the photograph. Examining it closely, the girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Her expression was solemn, almost haunting. "Someone lived here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But why was it sealed off?" Emily asked, her face pale. We didn't have an answer, but the atmosphere in the apartment shifted after that discovery. The crying stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even more unsettling. We tried to go about our lives, but the hidden room weighed heavily on us. Henry refused to go near the living room, and Emily became jumpy, startled by every creak and shadow. A few days later, I decided to dig deeper into the building's history. I visited the local library, poring over old records and newspaper archives. What I found chilled me to the bone. In the 1970s, the apartment's previous tenant had been a man named Walter Finch, a recluse with a troubled past. He had lived alone with his young daughter, Lila. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the apartment, but no one suspected the truth until it was too late. Lila had been found dead, her small body locked inside the hidden room. The cause of death was starvation. Walter claimed he was trying to protect her from the outside world, but his mental instability led to her tragic death. He was arrested and later died in prison, leaving the apartment to sit empty for years before being renovated and rented out again. When I told Emily what I'd discovered, she burst into tears. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to leave." I didn't argue. We packed up our belongings that night and left the apartment for good, staying with friends until we could find a new place. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of Lila's photograph, her dark eyes seeming to follow me. We later learned that no tenant had ever stayed in the apartment for long. Stories circulated about strange noises, unexplained cold spots, and sightings of a young girl in the living room. The landlord eventually gave up trying to rent it out, leaving the apartment to sit empty once more. Even now, years later, I still think about that hidden room and the tragedy it concealed. Late at night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes hear faint cries in the distance, and I wonder if Lila ever found peace, or if she's still there, trapped behind the walls, waiting for someone to hear her. Story number 3. The Midnight Knocks. Moving to Seoul was supposed to be the start of something new, a chance to escape the monotony of my small hometown in the Midwest. My name is Jason Kim, and I'd been working as an English teacher for about a year when I found the apartment. It was nothing fancy, just a small, one-bedroom unit in an aging high-rise on the outskirts of the city. The rent was cheap, and the neighborhood was quiet, which suited me fine. At least, that's what I thought at first. The knock started about 2 weeks after I moved in. It was always the same, a faint, rhythmic tapping on my front door at exactly 3 a.m. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a mistake, a neighbor knocking on the wrong door or maybe even a stray noise from the building settling. But as the nights passed, the knocking continued, soft and deliberate, always at the same time. By the fifth night, I was beginning to lose sleep. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, dreading the inevitable sound. And when it came, tap, 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 it was like an icy hand gripping my chest. I get up, heart pounding, and tiptoe to the peephole, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was responsible. But each time, the hallway was empty, illuminated only by the dim, flickering light of the old overhead bulb. I asked my neighbors if they had experienced anything similar, but they all shook their heads, some giving me puzzled looks, others offering polite, if disinterested, reassurances. Old buildings make strange noises, one of them said, smiling sympathetically, but I knew what I was hearing wasn't just the building. The knocks were too deliberate, too consistent. One night, after weeks of sleeplessness and growing paranoia, I decided to confront whatever or whoever was causing the disturbance. I stayed awake, sitting in the darkened living room with a baseball bat in hand, waiting for the sound. When the clock struck 3 a.m., the knocking began. Tap, tap, tap. I jumped to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me. Gripping the bat tightly, I threw the door open, ready to face the prankster or intruder once and for all. But the hallway was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no retreating footsteps, no doors closing, just the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Frustrated and shaken, I slammed the door shut, leaning against it as my mind raced. Was someone playing a cruel joke on me? Or was it something worse? That's when I decided to set up the camera. I borrowed a small motion-activated device from a friend, mounting it discreetly above the door. If someone or something was out there, I'd catch them in the act. That night, I went to bed feeling a strange mix of dread and anticipation, determined to uncover the truth. The knocking came as expected, but this time, I forced myself to stay in bed, resisting the urge to check the door. When the noise finally stopped, I fell into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures whispering my name. The next morning, I retrieved the camera, my hands trembling as I connected it to my laptop. The footage began with a few hours of uneventful stillness. The empty hallway bathed in dim, flickering light. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., she appeared. A woman, pale and disheveled, stood motionless in front of my door. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, obscuring her features. She wore a simple white dress, tattered and stained, as if she had wandered in from some forgotten place. For 2 hours, she remained there, occasionally raising her hand to knock softly, her lips moving as if she were whispering something. But no sound reached the camera. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her sway slightly, her movements unnatural, almost mechanical. She never looked directly at the camera, her gaze fixed firmly on my door. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she turned and walked out of frame, her figure dissolving into the shadows of the hallway. I took the footage to the police, hoping they could identify her or at least provide some explanation. The officer who reviewed the video furrowed his brow, his expression darkening as he replayed the clip. "There's no way someone could have been there that long without being noticed," he said. "The building has security cameras, and they didn't pick up anyone entering or leaving your floor." "Then who is she?" I asked, my voice trembling. The officer shook his head. "We'll look into it," he said, but the tone of his voice suggested he didn't expect to find anything. Days turned into weeks, and the police never contacted me again. The knocking continued, and I began to notice other things. Strange, almost imperceptible phenomena. Objects in my apartment would be slightly out of place when I woke up. My phone would vibrate with missed calls from unknown numbers. But when I answered, there was only static. And sometimes, late at night, I catch the faintest whiff of something floral, like old, decayed perfume. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and moved out, breaking my lease without a second thought. The landlord seemed unsurprised when I handed him the keys. "You're not the first," he said cryptically, his eyes avoiding mine. That apartment, it's seen things. I later learned that the previous tenant had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. A young woman, living alone, had been reported missing after friends and family couldn't reach her. The police found her apartment undisturbed, the door locked from the inside, but there was no sign of her. The case remained unsolved. I moved to a new neighborhood, far from that cursed building. But the memory lingers. Sometimes, I still wake up at 3 a.m., heart racing as I strain to hear the sound of knocking. And in those moments, I wonder if she found someone else's door to stand in front of, or if she's still there, in that dimly lit hallway, waiting for the next tenant to let her in. Story number 4. The locked apartment. When Sarah and I moved to Chicago, we were eager to start fresh. The city's vibrant energy, the towering skyscrapers, and the endless opportunities made it the perfect place for us. We found a small, affordable apartment in an old brick building just north of downtown. The building had a certain charm: worn wooden floors, high ceilings, and creaky stairs that seemed to tell stories of generations past. Apartment 4C was ours, and despite its age, felt like a cozy refuge. Our landlord, Mr. Alvarez, was an older man with a kind smile and a penchant for long stories about the building's history. "This place has seen a lot," he'd said when handing us the keys. "But don't worry, it's solid as a rock." We settled in quickly. Sarah decorated the living room with string lights and houseplants, while I set up a small office nook in the corner. The first few weeks were uneventful, save for the occasional creaks and groans of the old building. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened on that cold December night. It was a Friday evening, and we had been at a friend's holiday party a few blocks away. The air was bitterly cold, and snow fell in thick, silent flakes as we walked home. Sarah was laughing about something our friend had said, her cheeks rosy from the chill and a few glasses of wine. I held her hand tightly, eager to get back to the warmth of our apartment. When we reached the door to 4C, I pulled out my key, expecting the familiar click of the lock. Instead, the key wouldn't turn. I frowned, jiggling it in the lock. "Nothing." "Let me try," Sarah said, stepping forward. She had no luck either. The key slid in easily enough, but the lock refused to budge. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered. We had used the same key earlier that day without any issues. We knocked on the door, calling out, as if someone might somehow be inside, but the apartment was silent. Frustrated and confused, we called Mr. Alvarez, who arrived within minutes, bundled up against the cold. He tried his master key but had no more success than we did. "I don't understand," he said, scratching his head. "This lock's never given me trouble before." Eventually, we had no choice but to break the door open. Mr. Alvarez used a crowbar. The sound of splintering would echoing through the hallway. When the door finally swung open, all three of us froze. The apartment was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor. The cushions on the couch had been slashed, and shards of glass from a broken lamp littered the carpet. It looked as though someone had torn the place apart in a frenzy. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. But that wasn't the worst of it. As we stepped inside, we noticed the handprints, dozens of them, on the walls, the windows, and, most disturbingly, the ceiling. They were large, smudged, and dusty, as if made by someone who had crawled across the surfaces. The air in the apartment was icy, far colder than it should have been with the heater running. Mr. Alvarez checked the windows and the balcony door. "Locked from the inside," he said, his voice low. "There's no way anyone could have gotten in or out." A heavy silence fell over the room as we stared at the chaos. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a break-in? But how could someone have locked the door from the inside? And those handprints? They weren't normal. "Let's go," Sarah said suddenly, her voice shaking. "I don't want to stay here." I didn't argue. We packed a few essentials and left that night, crashing at a friend's place. Neither of us slept much. The image of those handprints haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something terrible. The next day, we returned to the apartment to gather the rest of our belongings. The mess was still there, but the air felt even heavier, almost oppressive. As we packed, Mr. Alvarez stopped by. "I didn't want to say anything last night," he began, his face pale. "But you should know about the man who lived here before you." Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What about him?" I asked. "His name was Peter Grayson," Mr. Alvarez said. "A quiet guy, kept to himself. About 10 years ago, I found him dead, right here in this apartment." He gestured to the center of the living room. "The coroner ruled it as a heart attack. But the way I found him," he trailed off, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Sarah prompted. "There were handprints," he said quietly. "On the walls, the ceiling, just like what you saw. No one could explain it. And the strangest part? The door was locked from the inside, just like last night." A chill ran down my spine. "Did anything else happen after that?" Mr. Alvarez hesitated. "I've rented this apartment out a few times since then, but no one stays longer than a few weeks. They all say the same thing: strange noises at night, things moving on their own, nightmares. One tenant even swore she saw Peter standing in the hallway, staring at her." We finished packing in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. By the time we left, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. For weeks after we moved out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard faint knocking or the sound of furniture scraping against the floor. Sarah had nightmares about the handprints, waking up in a cold sweat with tears streaming down her face. We eventually found another apartment, far from the old building, but the memories lingered. Every now and then, I'd look up 4C online, curious to see if anyone had moved in. Each time, the listing remained the same: vacant. The last time I checked, there was a new note on the listing: temporarily unavailable, maintenance required. I couldn't help but wonder if someone else had dared to move in, only to leave as quickly as we had. Even now, I can't walk past old buildings without glancing at the windows, half expecting to see dusty handprints or a shadowy figure watching from the inside. The experience left me with more questions than answers. But one thing is certain: some places hold onto their history in ways we'll never fully understand, and sometimes it's better to leave the past undisturbed. Story number 5. The neighbor in apartment 6B. Moving to New York City had always been a dream of mine. The lights, the energy, the promise of a fresh start, all of it drew me in like a moth to a flame. When I found a small but affordable apartment in a pre-war building on the Upper West Side, I couldn't believe my luck. The place had charm: creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and a sense of history that made it feel alive. Little did I know, that sense of life extended beyond what I could see. I moved in on a chilly January afternoon, the city shrouded in a soft gray haze. My apartment, 6A, was cozy, with a view of a narrow alley and the neighboring building. The landlord, Mr. Green, was an older man with a weathered face and a faint smell of cigar smoke. He handed me the keys with a tight smile, saying, "If you need anything, just let me know. And don't worry about the neighbors, they keep to themselves." I didn't think much of the comment at the time. The building was quiet, and I assumed most of the tenants were either elderly or simply reclusive. That suited me fine. After years of noisy roommates, I craved solitude. It was the second night when I first noticed him. I was unpacking in the living room when I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Glancing toward the door, I saw a shadow through the peephole, faint but distinct. Someone was standing just outside my apartment, motionless. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. The shadow didn't move. I approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole. The distorted lens revealed the figure of an older man, his face lined and hollow. He was staring directly at my door, his eyes unblinking. Startled, I stepped back, my heart racing. When I opened the door moments later, the hallway was empty, save for the faint flicker of a distant light bulb. I chalked it up to nerves. Moving to a new city was stressful, and I figured my imagination was playing tricks on me. But over the following weeks, the strange occurrences only grew. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, faint noises would drift through the wall I shared with 6B, the neighboring apartment. At first, it was subtle, the creak of floorboards, faint shuffling, but soon, it escalated. Heavy thuds echoed through the wall, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and utterly unnerving. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I decided to confront my neighbor. I'd seen him only fleetingly through the peephole, always standing just outside his door or, unnervingly, peeking at me through the narrow gap between the door and its frame. He never spoke, never moved when I noticed him. Gathering my courage, I knocked on the door of 6B. The sound echoed down the empty hallway. "Hello," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I live next door. I just wanted to ask about the noise at night." No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still, silence. Frustrated, I went to Mr. Green's office the next morning to file a complaint. When I mentioned 6B, his expression darkened. "Are you sure you heard noise coming from that apartment?" he asked, his tone unusually cautious. "Yes," I replied. "Every night. It's loud enough to wake me up." Mr. Green hesitated before leaning in slightly, lowering his voice. "There hasn't been anyone in 6B for years. The tenant who lived there, Mr. Connolly, died over a decade ago." I stared at him, stunned. "That's impossible. I've seen him. He's an older man. I've heard him moving around." Mr. Green shook his head. "Mr. Connolly was the last tenant. The apartment's been vacant ever since." I returned to my apartment in a daze, the weight of Mr. Green's words pressing down on me. That night, the noises returned louder, angrier. The dragging sound was punctuated by what sounded like muffled voices, faint and unintelligible. I sat in bed, clutching my blanket, my heart pounding in my chest. Determined to get answers, I began researching the building's history. Through old newspapers and city archives, I pieced together the story of Mr. Connolly. He had been a reclusive man, known for his strange behavior and obsessive habits. Neighbors reported hearing him talking to himself late at night, and some claimed he never left the apartment. When he died, alone and unnoticed for weeks, the authorities found his home in disarray. Most chillingly, they discovered a series of notebooks filled with ramblings about the voices in the walls and the visitors who wouldn't leave him alone. As the days passed, the atmosphere in my apartment grew more oppressive. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners, and the faint scent of cigar smoke wafted through the air. Despite the fact that I didn't smoke, the noises in 6B intensified, and one night, I woke to find my bedroom door ajar, though I was certain I had locked it. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my belongings and moved out within a month of moving in. The final night, as I locked my door for the last time, I glanced toward 6B. The faint glow of a light seeped through the edges of the door, and I swore I saw a shadow move inside. After I left, I kept in touch with a few of the remaining tenants. They told me that 6B remained empty, though lights were often seen flickering on and off at odd hours. Rumors spread about other tenants who had tried to move in, only to leave after weeks of sleepless nights and unsettling experiences. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that apartment. Sometimes, I dream of the hallway, the flickering lights, and the shadowed figure watching me through the peephole. And in those dreams, I hear the faint sound of dragging footsteps, moving closer and closer, until I wake in a cold sweat. I never went back to that building, but I'll always wonder about the truth of 6B. Was it just an overactive imagination, fueled by the stress of a new city and the eerie ambience of an old building? Or was Mr. Connolly right all along? Were there truly visitors in the walls? Unseen but always present, waiting for their next tenant? One thing is certain: some places hold onto their history in ways we can't explain. And sometimes, it's better to leave the past undisturbed.